man must do his will.
Hi, hello, and welcome to another edition of Public Interest. I'm Gabriela Patram. We're so happy that you can join us. With me is former President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and lead of the People's National Congress Reform, Mr. David Granger. Sir, welcome. It's always a pleasure to have you every week.
It's always a pleasure to be back on this program. Thank you.
Sir, today our discussion is going to be centered around the Guyana-Venezuela controversy, as we label it. As we know, the matter regarding our border issue is before the ICJ. So we're going to have a little bit of discussion centered around that. My first question is, the Venezuela's decree number 4415 in January claimed sovereign rights in the waters and seabed adjacent to the Guyana's coast, west of the Essequibo River. What was this decree intended to achieve?
Well, first of all, we have to put the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy in context.
Okay.
And historically, Venezuela has claimed, well, the entire Essequibo, literally from Perica, going west. Geographically, Venezuela is a Caribbean country, and paradoxically, Guyana is not a Caribbean country. Guyana is an Atlantic country. Our entire coastline is with the Atlantic, and Venezuela's entire coast is with the Caribbean. And from a strategic point of view, Venezuela aspired to becoming an Atlantic state, so that it could deploy its navies and submarines. From a Caribbean point of view, Venezuela, as you know, possesses the largest volume of proven petroleum reserves in the world, and much of Venezuela's oil passes through the Caribbean. So Venezuela was always concerned about the security of the Caribbean, and it felt that by strengthening its navy and its armed forces, and by getting an outlet to the Atlantic, it would be able to reinforce the control of the Caribbean to protect its petroleum exports. So in a historical perspective, Venezuela felt that by controlling the Essequibo territory, it would get the Essequibo coast. And in fact, one of the first decrees it passed in 1968, when President Leone was president of Venezuela, decree number 1152, they tried to claim the entire Essequibo coast. This would give it what they call a salida al Atlántico, an exit or corridor into the Atlantic. So the present decree is really a continuation of several other decrees which have been issued by the president of Venezuela since 1968. It wants to dominate the Caribbean, and it wants now to get access to petroleum resources. At first it was strategic for its navy and its armed forces to control an Atlantic coast, but now it is economic, because in addition to possessing the largest volume of petroleum reserves in the world, Venezuela has, within recent years, come to the view that, well, the world has come to the view that, petroleum reserves in Guyana and Suriname are also immense. So it has shifted from being purely strategic to also now being economic. So that is the reasoning behind the most recent. Now, finally, you must bear in mind that in December, the matter came before the ICJ, and the ICJ determined that it had jurisdiction. And the Venezuelan decree of January this year, 4415, is really coming 1 month after the ICJ made that statement. So it was meant to convince its own population, because many Venezuelans believe that Essequibo is theirs. It is meant to send a signal to the world at large that this area is under some form of claim. and it's meant to threaten Guyana. So there are different publics. There's a local public in Venezuela, there is an international public, and there's a Guyanese public, and there's a corporate public as well. They want to tell all the petroleum companies, this is not Guyanese territory, and if you conduct exploration or exploitation, you are coming on Venezuelan territory. It is false, but those are the reasons behind this decree. So the decree is very important in terms of history and geography, strategy, and the economy.
Sir, the country has also made another decree number 1787 of 26th of May 2015, and it was issued at the onset of the petroleum discoveries in the Atlantic. What was this decree intended to achieve as well?
Well, as you know, the 26th of May 2015 was our Independence Day, and it was also the day in which President Granger, had his inaugural parade at the National Stadium. So it was a sort of birthday present for the nation. So it was well timed. But before that date, many Guyanese were unaware, and I must admit that even going into the government, what we inherited from the PPP did not point to the volume of petroleum reserves and resources. But Venezuela knew. Venezuela is a very highly organized country, especially in the petroleum industry, and it probably knew very well why Exxon was there and what Exxon was up to. And Exxon really made a very big discovery, and the decree of 26th of May 2015, number 1787, was meant to signal to the world that in Venezuela's perception, this was illegal exploitation of resources on territory that it claimed. So it was, in a way, a follow-up to everything that had been happening since 1966 or even 1968. It was meant to send a signal to Exxon. It was meant to send a signal to other petroleum exploration companies. And bear in mind, in 2013, President Maduro came here when President Ramatara was there. And a few weeks after Maduro went back home, they seized the Technic Perdana, which was conducting petroleum exploration in that very zone, maritime zone that Venezuela claimed. So they're all connected. These are not, disparate incidents. It's all part of Venezuelan strategy. And the strategy might have changed a little bit in 2015 to put greater focus on petroleum and greater focus on Exxon, because under Chavez's administration in Venezuela, some of the Exxon assets, I think, were nationalized. So Venezuela had some conflict with Exxon as a corporation. And Exxon was, as of May 2015, was the major exploration company in Guyana's maritime zone. So it was meant to send a signal to Granger and to Exxon and to the rest of the world. That was what that decree of May 2015 was all about.
Sir, in January 2018, the United Nations Secretary General chose the ICJ as a means of settlement of the territorial question. What has been the Secretary General's role in the territorial question?
Well, starting just before independence in 1966, the Geneva Agreement, signed between the United Kingdom, because we were still a colony, Venezuela, and British Guyana, gave the Secretary General a role in identifying a peaceful solution to the territorial controversy at that time. So from the outset, even before independence, the United Nations Secretary General had a role. That role remained because under Chapter 6 of the Charter of the United Nations, countries ought not to go to war. Countries ought to seek peaceful resolution of disputes. So there was a mixed commission to start with, and that was going nowhere. You know, the Venezuelans were very uncooperative, and they were making demands. They were providing interpretations to the Geneva Agreement, which were unacceptable. And after some time, it was realized that the mixed commission couldn't function. And at that time, Guyana, as it came to becoming a republic, was assisted by Trinidad and Tobago, and we had an accord to place the territorial conflict in a sort of moratorium for 12 years. And that was brokered by, I think, Dr. Eric Williams. And we had a 12-year, I wouldn't call it a moratorium, but it was a pause. But between 1970, when we became a republic, and 1982. But after that period expired, Venezuela became very belligerent, very hostile, and under President Hoyt, we were able to go further along the road of seeking a peaceful solution to the controversy, and the United Nations Secretary General appointed a good officer in 1990. And that good officer process started, but, you know, like the mixed commission, you know, it was really meant to broker or facilitate discussions among, you know, the parties, basically Venezuela and Guyana. But that was not satisfactory. And when I became president, and when we were aware that Venezuela aggression, hostility, resistance to development in the Essequibo, well, all 4 regions of the Essequibo, it was decided that we needed to move the process forward. I met Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and he was very helpful. I think he understood the plight of a small state. I went to the United Nations, and in 2017, I went to the United Nations again and had a meeting with Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And I was very happy that just a few months after that meeting, Secretary General decided to use his powers under Chapter 6 of the United Nations Charter to send that controversy to the ICJ. So he has played a key role in the peaceful settlement of the controversy. Well, it hasn't settled as yet, but at least once it remained under his jurisdiction in accordance with the Geneva Agreement, we were, in a way, protected from open hostilities. It was a very slow process, and I'm very glad that under my presidency we were able to move it forward. Now it's at the court, and in December last year, the court ruled or asserted its jurisdiction, and it is our expectation that the agreement of 1899, the arbitral agreement of 1899, will vindicate Guyana's possession of all 216,000 square kilometers, and of course the sea space. So we are on our way to bringing this 55-year-old controversy, well, more than 55 years, but since independence, we have been burdened, or people have been burdened with this controversy. So during that period, there were lots of hostile acts by the Venezuelans, and I think the Secretary General presence or a superintendence of the process, contributed to ensuring that the situation didn't deteriorate.
So on that same note, you just mentioned importantly that the ICJ would have asserted its jurisdiction to determine the territorial question, and this happened in December of 2020. Mm-hmm. Why is Venezuela opposed to the ICJ's jurisdiction?
It is my considered view that Venezuela um, the Venezuelan authorities are aware of the validity of the 1899 agreement, and they are aware of the flimsiness of their case. So from the earliest stages, Venezuela tried to keep it away from the courts and tried to negotiate on a bilateral basis. That is why they were so, so much in love with the mixed commission, because you could go on talking forever. While they put other measures in place to woo or to coerce Guyana into cooperating with them. So the ICJ will give a ruling, and that ruling will be definitive. But Venezuela is, up to now, up to January, still trying to resist the involvement of the ICJ, because that will give a legal ruling which is going to be binding. International community will know beyond a shadow of a doubt that any further claims on Guyanese territory will be unsupportable and will be illegal. So Venezuela is still keen on direct talks with Guyana, hoping to use its weight and its influence and its power to keep Guyana in a subordinate position. In international relations, there's this concept of Finlandization. It's not a popular expression nowadays, but there used to be a relationship between USSR and Finland, in which USSR was so huge and powerful and dominant that Finland virtually had to seek permission to take certain initiatives. That is historical. It doesn't happen now, of course. And this concept of Finlandization is what Venezuela has tried to impose on us, that whatever we want to do in those 4 regions of the Essequibo, we must seek permission from Venezuela. That Finlandization didn't work, and ICJ involvement is meant to provide a definitive ruling so that the dispute comes to an end and to be solved for all time for our children and grandchildren and generations to come.
Sir, Venezuela's border policy to Guyana has been described as Chavismo. How does Chavismo describe Venezuela's border policy? But sir, if I may ask you, what is the meaning of Chavismo?
Well, there is a word. You can Google it. There is a word. It comes from Hugo Chavez Frias, the former president of Venezuela. He died from cancer at a very young age. I think he's 58. So Chavismo is the type of philosophy or politics practiced by Chavez, who essentially was a socialist. He was a strong centralist in terms of concentrating power in the presidency. And there was also an international dimension, and that he tried to extend this concept of Bolivarian socialism to the countries of the Caribbean. I call it Chavismo because if you go to Anbawak on the West Coast, you'll see a building dedicated to the memory of Hugo Chavez Frias. And you go around the Caribbean, he'd build a stadium here, he'd build a port, he'd build, an airport, monuments. He was regarded in the Caribbean as a great benefactor. But there's a darker side to Chavismo. That is that he inherited a set of policies which were from the time of Bureli Rivas. Bureli Rivas was a foreign minister in the early 1990s. And the Venezuelan foreign ministers are well educated, and they're very consistent in their philosophy, and they had this policy of globality. So they tried to convince Guyanese statesmen and presidents to deal with territorial issues on a bilateral basis, and not to deal with it in a technical sense about maritime zones, but in a holistic sense. And they would offer transportation and financial inducements and rice shipments and cheap oil. So when you look at it in a global point of view, you feel that you're gaining. In the narrowest point of view, it is just them and us, the border is here. But through this concept of globality, and there are all of the foreign ministers, Gabriela and Granger and Borelli Rivas, they spoke of joint development. It's a trap. They want to, we can't think of joint development of one of their states, but they want to think of joint development of four of our regions. So this concept of globality, maybe it's a mistake to call it Chavismo, but it lured some of our statesmen into thinking that Venezuela was a dear friend. And I believe that the two Jagans, Chetty Jagan and Janet Jagan, might have been induced to think that the whole territorial threat was a figment, was invention of the PNC, and they were going to solve this problem. So within 6 months of going into office in 1962, Dr. Chetty Jagan was in Caracas. He got the order of the Liberator, and I think he had a holiday at Margarita, and they were feted. Mrs. Janet Jagan, she went to Venezuela in a Venezuelan Air Force plane. You're going to negotiate with somebody, with a country that is claiming your territory, you go in the enemy's Air Force plane. So I think they tried to airbrush the conflict, the territorial dispute, and I think as a result of that, we started to accept gifts. As you know, there's, as I said, the Hugo Chavez Center in West Babis, there's a gymnasium, and I think under Mr. Jagdio, $12 million debt was written off. There's a housing scheme. You got some houses on the East Coast. They promised to build a road. We were to get electricity from Guridam. There is a mountain of agreements which on the surface seem to be favorable to a poor country like Guyana. And when we were strapped for cash and when we were going through economic difficulties, there were people who might have been persuaded to concede, a bit of land to allow Venezuela to have this salida al Atlántico. And in exchange for these economic benefits, to surrender some of your sovereignty. That is what globality was all about. That's what Chavismo was all about. And he came here. It was a charm offensive. You're hugging babies and laughing and joking and offering his interpreter a glass of water. But he was very serious about territory. He admitted that when he was in the army, they were actually planning invasion of Guyana. And what I can say is that all of these agreements, the ALBA, which is the Bolivarian Initiative for Latin America and the Caribbean, Petro-Caribe, the Caracas Energy Accord. Venezuela is very rich, and I admit that there were material benefits for many Caribbean countries, but at the same time, the Caribbean was being divided. In the 70s, the Caribbean was, fully behind Venezuela, fully supportive of Venezuela. But by the time I became president in 2015, there were some people who were favoring Venezuela's policy of globality. And I must say this, Barbados stood up for us, Prime Minister Frandel Stewart, at the CARICOM heads of government in 2015. In fact, President Maduro wanted to come to the conference, to address the conference. And Prime Minister Stewart said, no, that wouldn't happen. and he put an end to Venezuela's attempt to influence CARICOM prime ministers directly. And I think he helped in so doing to preserve Guyana's integrity and the integrity of CARICOM as well. So I would say that that policy is still attractive to some people who don't realize the seriousness of our territorial integrity. But now they see what is coming out of the maritime zone claimed by Guyana. They realize what Venezuela was after 50 years ago. That if we had given the concessions in return for some road or some bridge or some, cultural center or some gymnasium, we would have been much poorer today. So we stood up for our rights, and unfortunately, some of our leaders were swayed by this Chavismo, by this globality that was very prominent in Venezuelan frontier politics, particularly between 1992 and 2015. I would say that it came to an end in 2015, and Maduro, who thought he was the heir of Chavez, changed and became much more hostile after that, in terms of, the aggression, in terms of arresting fishermen, arresting petroleum exploration vessels, and, overflights of our territory. Since 2015, there have been lots of aggressive incidents.
Sir, Venezuela's challenges to Guyana's sovereignty, like you mentioned earlier, has persisted for over 55 years. Recently, on September 6, we would have seen that the Venezuelan government and the opposition representatives now have adopted a common posture on the territorial question. I pose those two together to ask you, what is the way forward for us?
I would say that let's deal with one thing at a time.
Okay.
The meeting of representatives of the Venezuelan government and the opposition in Mexico City is essentially internal. But they have used the territorial question to create this impression of unity. The one thing they agreed on is that they must reclaim or claim the Essequibo. So that was the purpose of the meeting, to bring about an internal solution to the Venezuelan constitutional issue. In that regard, in that respect, I don't know how far it will go. I know the Norwegians were involved. Again, the Norwegians, I had met the same man, Mr. Nylander. He came here trying to broker an agreement, with Venezuela. Luckily, the involvement of the Secretary General of the United Nations superseded what Nylander was trying to do. And he's at it again. And as far as I'm concerned, if he wants to solve Venezuela internal politics, he could do that. But in terms of the relationship with Guyana, that's a completely different matter. What we now know, or what we can see, is that Venezuelan government and opposition are united. Now, over the last half century or more, education on the territorial issue has been embedded in Venezuela. They have maps, they have stamps, they have all types of paraphernalia showing that, they claim to Venezuela. Every now and then, people turn up at Ettring Bang, students, members of the National Assembly, and there's some demonstration, Essequibo is ours, and that type of thing. So it's a serious matter. Venezuela also has an efficient foreign service. No matter there's talk about migrants and, meltdown in Venezuela. Venezuela has a very efficient foreign service, and they don't fool around with their policies. And this is something Guyana must learn, that we must have a highly trained public service, a highly trained foreign service, and we mustn't change policies because you don't like the previous party that was in office. There must be consistency, there must be continuity. So what is the way forward out of all of that? I would say that we are on the correct path.
Okay.
There must be greater involvement of the opposition and civil society in resisting Venezuela, resisting the inducements.
A holistic approach.
Well, I don't want to call it globalistic, it's call it holistic.
Holistic, right.
But definitely the government of Guyana must see the territorial question as national, not as partisan. I believe in everything that has happened over the last 14 months, there has been some visible cooperation
Yes.
between the opposition and the government. It must be intensified. There must be no daylight, or there must not be any daylight between the government and opposition on this territorial question. There must be more education, and this is what happened in Suriname as well. The Surinamese National Assembly, Surinamese population is educated, although I believe incorrectly, in thinking that the New River district is part of their territory. But the Venezuelans are thoroughly convinced, in the National Assembly, in the government, in the schools, in civil society, that that territory is theirs. So the way forward, I think we are on the correct path. We are now before the ICJ, and the government must move closer, must provide more information to the people of Guyana, must embrace the opposition, and the Venezuelans must not try that Chavismo, that globality maneuver that they tried, in the 1990s again. They must know that Guyana is united and that we are going to fight to defend our country. So that's where we stand. We are on the path to solution through the ICJ, and I think our children could look forward to a country which is safe and secure from foreign aggression.
Sir, thank you very much. I really did enjoy this TPI. It's very edifying, so thank you very much, and looking forward to have you with me again next week. And to our viewers, we say thank you very much for joining us. I'm Gabriela Patram, and of course, as always, on behalf of all of us here at TPI, we continue to encourage you to follow all COVID-19 guidelines. Goodbye.